Hello, I'm Chester Levosh, the project archaeologist with the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project. If this is your first time joining us, the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project is a 501c3 not-for-profit dedicated to archaeological recording, conservation of natural and cultural resources, and public education through outreach engagement and public school curriculums. Our namesake is a 12-mile, 20-kilometer-long mesa with over 60,000 petroglyphs recorded to date, and that's a number that only keeps increasing. The mesa's history spans from the earliest arrival of people in the Southwest at the end of the last ice age up through U.S. statehood.
Hello, my name is Ethan Ortega, and I'm the manager of New Mexico's newest designated historic site, Los Luceros, which is located in Alcalde, New Mexico. Currently, Los Luceros is closed to the public due to COVID-19. But when we reopen, the site features a lovely visitor center, historic buildings that date to the 17th century, archaeological sites that date to the 14th century, a historic apple orchard and agricultural fields that are still in use today, as well as 3 miles of trails that wind through the beautiful property and including the bosque along the Rio Grande.
Since access to both the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project and the Los Luceros State Historic Site are greatly limited due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are pleased to bring you a virtual version of the Mesa Talks. Mesa Talks is a collaborative monthly lecture series brought to you in partnership by the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project and Los Luceros State Historic Site. Please follow our respective newsletters, our social media accounts, Facebook, Instagram, for news, events, and announcements. Please join us virtually on August 25th for a visual feast of the best petroglyphs recorded on Mesa Prieta in 2019, as presented by our very own Candy Bordoon. At the beginning of each year, 40 trained MPPP recording volunteers are invited to participate in voting for the best of the previous year's recording on Mesa Prieta. Candy will present these recordings, the most spectacular, well-made, unique, well-documented selections of petroglyphs and other archaeological features recorded in 2019. This is a rare opportunity to see images on several parcels of private land that are not normally seen by the general public. Now, many people have asked the project when access to the Wells Petroglyph Preserve will be available. At this time, the preserve is closed to tours, and tours are unavailable. Please know that when we are able to reopen, we will make announcements via social media, so please do follow us. In the meantime, we are hard at work developing media and creative virtual tours of the preserve. Stay tuned for more.
Today I'm happy to introduce my former boss, Matthew Barbour, who will share with us about the archaeology of hunting in New Mexico. Matthew J. Barbour holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts degree in anthropology from the University of New Mexico and has worked for the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs since 2002. Currently, he is the regional manager of Coronado and Jemez historic sites. Throughout his 18-year career, he has published over 200 nonfiction articles and monographs. In 2012, and again in 2014, Mr. Barbour was awarded the City of Santa Fe Heritage Preservation Award for Excellence in Archaeology. In 2018, under Mr. Barbour's management, Coronado Historic Site received an Award of Merit from the American Association for State and Local History. Then, in 2019, Jemez Historic Site received the Archaeology Heritage Preservation Award from the New Mexico Historic Preservation Division. Be sure to stick around at the end of the lecture where Matthew will answer any questions you might have. You can post your questions in the comments below, and we'll answer as many as time allows. Thank you and enjoy the talk.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Matt Barbour, and I'm here to talk to you today about, who am I? My name is Matt Barbour. I'm the regional manager of Jemez and Coronado Historic Site for New Mexico Historic Sites, a division of the Department of Cultural Affairs. This lecture and talk I'm going to be giving you tonight is called An Archaeological Perspective on Hunting in New Mexico. Through my career, I've been blessed to work for DCA for almost 20 years now. And during that time, I both worked as an archaeologist for the Office of Archaeological Studies and now as a manager for New Mexico historic sites. And this talk here is pretty much based upon my earlier archaeological work throughout the state, but not specifically on any detailed project, but rather an overview of archaeology and hunting in New Mexico. And what do I mean by that? Well, hunting is an expression of culture. So if we were to start with hunting in kind of a broad overview, it's always been a pivotal activity for all Native American groups from the Paleoindian period to the present day. Hunting is something you do, but it's more than just a skill set. It's an expression of culture. It's an ethnological trait. How you hunt, what you hunt, and where you do that hunting has all changed through time. And so these all represent expressions in culture that we can then study through the archaeological record. So how do we study those through the archaeological record? There's a lot of different ways. The archaeological evidence is pretty varied. What you're looking at here in this slide is a hunting blind in the Cook's Range overlooking Clark's Draw. We believe this hunting blind here probably dates to at least the Archaic period, was used by peoples much, much later in time period. But certainly, so the types of evidence include things like this hunting blind, but also things like geospatial and chronometric distribution of human occupation. What does that mean? It means where are archaeological sites located on the landscape and what period they date to. Certainly the features themselves that you see like here. Flake stone technology, the tools used to acquire animals and where they get those tools from, where do they get the sources of the materials to make those tools. Fauna, animal bones are a huge, important part of the archaeological evidence associated with hunting. But then also human beings and their skeletal remains are also important. Nutritional deficiencies in human, in bones, in trace elements, or occupational injuries are often evidence of hunting activities. This last topic we're really not going to touch upon in this lecture, but it's an important part of reconstructing the past as well. So the goals of this lecture, really simple. We're going to look broad strokes at hunting in New Mexico from the Paleo-Indian through the historic period, primarily looking at Native American patterns of hunting. However, these are going to cross over with later arrivals, mostly people of European descent during the historic periods. We're going to reflect upon how these changes in hunting kind of influenced and were influenced by other cultural developments occurring at the same time. So what else is going on when people are hunting and why does it change? And then we're going to discuss why divergent hunting strategies have been developed over time amongst contemporaneous ethnic groups. Why are Pueblo people's hunting strategies so different than mobile hunter and gatherer groups like the pre-contact Athabascan groups, or as you know them today, more the Navajo and Apache groups, and how these different strategies shape the interactions between these communities. Okay, one thing we're not going to talk about, but it's important to mention, is gender. Most people, when they hear hunting, they go, "Oh, well, that's something men do." Not really, no. Hunting can be done by anybody. Gender roles have always been fluid, and often we assign them based on ethnographic analogy, which is to say that we look at, as Anglos or as European peoples, we tend to look at, for example, what's going on in New Mexico when Europeans get there, and then we take whatever the early explorers saw, and we just take those ideas and cast them back on people in time. And sometimes they're accurate, sometimes they're not, but it can be very problematic to just use a direct approach like that. Who does what is always open to change. And even if you were to take the stance that it's mostly, if we look at since the dawn of time, mostly men have killed the animals. Even if you were to take that approach, women are most often the ones to butcher, cook, and preserve the meat. So even if you were to take the role that men hunt, which men and women hunt, women were the primary played primary roles in butchering, cooking, and preserving the meat. Of course, men did that as well too. So gender is not always something that is easily expressed. And here we have a young lady with a mule deer showing that she can just as easily take down those bucks. So if we're going to start with any discussion of huntings in the Americas, we have to get people into the Americas. And there's really three principal, maybe four, if I was really being honest, kind of migration discussions into how humans got into the Americas. The original one was a land bridge across from Asia. They followed it down. They followed an ice-free corridor into North America. There's very limited evidence of people living in that supposed ice-free corridor during the late Pleistocene. Another option has been that they're actually the early people who migrated into the Americas came from Europe, and the Solutrean hypothesis, which is not good. It's just a terrible idea. Clovis technology does share some traits common with the Solutrean peoples, but the time frame's all off. It's really not a good bet. It's also very clear that Native American peoples have more of an Asian origin to them. Some people argue for maybe a Polynesian route, which is not depicted on this slide. But the most common nowadays amongst archaeologists, the most widely accepted view is a coastal migration. So instead of there being following an ice-free corridor, literally what you have is people in small boats following along a series of islands that were actually much larger. Sea levels were much lower. They ended up on the coast of Canada. They moved south. They may have even actually gone into California some, but were stopped at the mountain ranges in eastern California. Didn't get any farther. These people would have had diets akin to coastal foragers along California today, and in the northern regions would have looked relatively similar to the Inuit and other northern peoples in the Americas, exclusively, working primarily on meats and fish, and then as they get down into California, more onto coastal foods such as shellfish and things of that nature. The most strongest evidence in the Southwest for how people get into the Southwest today it actually comes from Mexico. Recent evidence along the coast of Sonora really showed that Sonora was a giant swamp at the time humans got there. And an animal called the Gomanther, which I'm probably pronouncing that terrible, kind of like a form of swamp elephant, if you want to look at it that way. It's a swamp elephant. It's not really a swamp elephant, but you get the idea from it. Human beings, for some reason, in the Sonoran area, in these swamps, started to turn away, and instead of hunting the aquatic mammals and fish and things of that nature, they start to hunt these swamp elephants. Interestingly enough, these swamp elephants, up until recently, were thought extinct before human beings even got in the area. But recent work in the Sonora area, primarily done by a graduate student at the University of Arizona by the name of Guadalupe Sanchez, who wrote about it in her recent dissertation, which has been published since then, looked at the fact that these Clovis hunters and gatherers were really hunting these swamp elephants. And if you can imagine, it's not much of a jump from a swamp elephant to a larger mammoth creature. And it appears that human beings enter the Southwest hunting these large megafauna around 10,000 BC. And probably the entrance is through the San Pedro Valley in kind of southeastern Arizona. This leads to what we call the Paleoindian Period. These Paleoindian hunters really are often characterized as large game hunters. Certainly, they ate a lot of different things, but they're really known for their distinctive projectile points, which you can see on the right-hand side. The first of those projectile point traditions is Clovis, and it goes down to Folsom points and eventually Plano or Plainview points in New Mexico. They hunt a variety of game. And in fact, we can see some of these projectile points here with different times associated with them. These points, these large lancelet projectile points, are really big. They're designed specifically to hunt large game. You don't need a Clovis point to hunt a rabbit. You have a Clovis point because the animal you're taking is much, much larger than yourself. And they're hunting these large megafauna that you see. And they're shooting them with not a bow and arrow, but a kind of a dart technology or javelin technology, shot from an atlatl. An atlatl just kind of extends your arm. We also think, based upon some of the evidence of breakage of these materials, that they may have also been thrusting these at the animal. During this time period, when you want to date a site, usually the first thing you use is projectile point morphology. So the type of point you have tells you what kind of site or what type of time frame you're looking at, with Clovis being the earliest and Plainview being the latter. Initial strategies for these guys entering into the American Southwest really centered on these marshy areas, not surprisingly, considering they probably come from the marshlands of Sonora. In fact, when we see them in the Albuquerque area, their camps in the Albuquerque area, they're really around these extinct lakes known as shallow lake playas. They hang out at these. The animals would come up, they drink water from these. And they would ambush the animals, usually taking a single animal in these ambush kills. The biggest, most famous playa that you probably think of is my kind of home or home in New Mexico. The area of the Estancia Basin around Moriarty, just south of Moriarty, used to be a very large shallow lake. Now it's a diverse amount of small lakes. But originally it was one big large lake. This hunting strategy transitioned during probably mostly into the Folsom times of really these forced stampedes or corral killings in which animals are kind of guided either over a ledge or into an area with netting and then killed in mass. This strategy, this later strategy used by later Paleoindian peoples, really appears to, in many cases, you get these huge bone beds in which hunters and gatherers are killing more animals than they could possibly consume. So it's not a waste, not want, not strategy. And if you can imagine, many animals during these time periods actually go extinct. Recently, and I don't have a slide in here for this, but it's important to mention this. Why do they hunt so much animals early on? Why don't they work on plant resources too? And the interesting thing is, if you're thinking about this from a hunting and gathering perspective, or even a survival perspective, if you walk out your door today, if you're unfamiliar with the land, you walk out the door today, almost any animal you encounter, you can cook and eat and gain calories from. That's not true with plant species. Most plants are actually either cannot be processed by the human body or actually can be possibly fatal to the human body. Acquiring and exploiting plant resources requires a lot of trial and error, much more so than hunting animals does or hunting game does. So usually if the narrative across the entire world is human beings move into an area and they start hunting animals to a large extent and then eventually focus on plant resources. Yes, that's because the animals become less plentiful, but it's also because that time has been taken for people to recognize what's good to eat, what's not good to eat, how they can manage their plant resources. But really, in the case of hunting in New Mexico, we get our first mass extinction event. And this happens throughout North and South America. It's not uncommon. We see as human beings enter a region, it's not that Native Americans or indigenous peoples were worse on the environment. The same thing, we can track the exact same mass extinction patterns in Australia. Pretty much Aborigines get there, and the number of species of animal species on the continent declines. This is very normal. But the impacts of human predation, to say that it's like one for one, the environment was changing as well. So the impact Native Americans had on these extinction events is still not clear, but certainly in New Mexico or in the greater Southwest, and I'm going to include Sonora there, we can look at an extinction pattern of swamp elephant mammoth, and then bison antiquus. So the swamp elephant's gone, then the mammoth, then the lower bison antiquus, which is a different animal than our modern day bison, but it's a much bigger form. So we see the same pattern regardless. So yes, it can be climate change, but it's linked in areas where climate change was definitely not the cause as well. And as these animals decline, people have to diversify, right? They have to focus on a more diverse array of game, and they have to start to focus on plant resources. They have to kind of adapt. And people also, as the population gets larger, people can't move around on the landscape like they did. So during the Clovis period, for example, people move around the landscape widely. They went all over the place. During the Folsom time, they were still traveling a lot, but maybe not as much. And then certainly as time went on, their ranges kind of reduced as there's more and more people there. But the diversification in plant resources transfers into a period known as Archaic in New Mexico. Now, the Archaic's regional. So depending upon what part of New Mexico I'm in will depend upon how I discuss the Archaic tradition. Now, obviously, I can't talk about all the Archaic period traditions in the American Southwest. The most famous is, of course, the Oshara tradition coming out of the Four Corners, made famous by Cynthia Irwin Williams. It's got a beautiful kind of change in projectile points. The interesting thing that comes out of the Oshara tradition is a clear example of the fact that Paleo-Indian, the gradual change from Paleo-Indian to Pueblo peoples that we know today, the transition in their culture was very, very gradual. A lot of times you'll read in historic accounts of different areas that it's huge migrations of people that change culture. So agriculture, for example, people early on wanted to make agriculture. A new wave of Mexican migrants or Mexican peoples from central Mexico that had cultivated maize move up into the American Southwest. Well, certainly corn does, and certainly maybe some population did, but the changes were so gradual in the population. So you can really make the argument that the people who existed, the Native American peoples, and this is important, the Native American peoples, for example, in the Albuquerque area, so the Tiwish-speaking Pueblos of Sandia and Isleta, those people have been on the landscape in that area since Paleo-Indian times, and they continue to live there today. With Archaic period peoples, we see a kind of a shift towards seasonal patterns more and more. So you're going where you think you can encounter game during the year. During the Paleo-Indian period, this was supposedly, most of the time you'd focus on where you could get large game during the year. But for Archaic peoples, it really focused on what plants were in season at what times and being in those areas. So hunting became more of an incidental activity that occurs in those locations during harvest. So what does that mean? Well, so if a Native American was pursuing native grasses, say along the Rio Grande, they might also take waterfowl and fish with nets. If they're harvesting mesquite, that's a great area to take a rabbit stick, and it's the ideal location to take all your different lagomorphs, your rabbits, your jackrabbits, and other rodents as well. In pinon stands, you're collecting nuts, but maybe they're also hunting mule deer when time allows. So you're exploiting the local environment. You're moving around in that environment seasonally, but seasonally based upon plant resources. Projectile points continue to evolve. So the points during the early Archaic are still really big, and as time moves on, they get smaller and smaller. While projectile point size isn't necessarily linked to the size of the game you're hunting, if you're primarily hunting bigger animals, it would make sense to have mostly bigger, a bigger projectile point. But as time goes on, they're taking more and more smaller game, and the projectile points are showing this. Also, the value, the use of your projectile points, they're going down in size, but they're also going down in I don't want to say skill, but in importance in the material culture. Clovis points and Folsom points, especially Folsom points, are the finest example of flint napping or producing of projectile points or stone. For you guys, stone arrowheads, even though that word's wrong in this case, are not arrows, heads, that you will ever find in the New World. It is a very hard to flute to take the large flake off the center of a fulsome point. You have to be very, very skilled to do it. As time goes on, the skill needed to build these projectile points actually goes down quite a bit, just showing that hunting itself is becoming a little bit more secondary importance relative to gathering, per se. There's also quite a bit of regional variability in projectile point styles as time goes on. And in fact, a lot of the times when we start to explore, especially by the Archaic period, it's probably time to introduce our first concept, which is optimal foraging theory. So most archaeologists look at the fact that every animal and plant resource, and this is an example of the Archaic, which I know are in South America, but this is actually, I learned using the Archaic. Kim Hill was actually at UNM during my undergraduate. So when I took human evolutionary ecology, which was my first real foray into anthropological views of hunters and gatherers in terms of hunting and cost, a value of resources, everything has a value. When you look at a meal in the freezer today, you can look at its caloric intake and you can decide which is a better choice for you. Well, the hunters and gatherers did the same thing. They may not have known exactly, but there's valued targets. So, for example, a deer has a much higher return than a rabbit. However, a rabbit might have more caloric return than a mouse. All things being equal, you want the deer first. You'll take the rabbit. You'll settle for the mouse. Or you'll settle for the rabbit, and if you really need to, you'll eat the mouse. And so if everything was equal, you'd only take your high ranked resources, and that's really what you see with Paleo-Indian hunters, right? They're primarily hunting the big game. They're hunting those big, high value resources. But as time goes, if you don't have access to those resources, you take things lower and lower down on the list. And what you find in the archaeological record is that if you only see one or two kind of animals represented sometimes, that means they're doing really well. They're very focused on what they're doing. But if they're hunting a lot of different kind of animals, it's usually a indicator of environmental or population stress. So here's kind of a breakdown of an example of what the diet breadth or what people were eating in the Archaic. So you got your big game on there. And this is, I believe I took these from Hyrule Cave, which is published by the Department of Transportation. It was a project a buddy of mine did years ago in southeastern New Mexico. But if you'll notice, a lot of the animals are not, there are big game on there, but there's a lot of smaller things. There's a lot of smaller birds, such as flickers, jays. Turtles are actually a relatively high-valued resource, not because they provide a huge amount of meat, but they're usually pretty easy to acquire. A turtle doesn't run away, and most of a turtle's defenses are not very good against a human being. But we also see things on there that a large game, you have your pronghorn, which most people in America call antelope. They're not really, just to be clear, pronghorn are not really an antelope. They're a separate species of animal. True antelope live in Africa, or they've been, as we'll talk about, sometimes those kind of animals are brought into the United States for hunting opportunities. They're not native to the United States. And of course, the big one during bison and mule deer, your big two in that area. Then you have your middle game, you have your jackrabbit, but you also have things like chipmunk and vole. And some of these things can get into the archaeological record other ways. However, you'd be amazed 9 times out of 10, even when it's an animal, you think, well, God, they wouldn't eat that. They totally would. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a protein source is a protein source. It's during the Archaic period that agriculture kind of comes into the mix, and it's a result of that dietary stress, that eating of those smaller animals, and bad years in which things don't come up. It should be noted that agriculture is not brought in. It doesn't start with sedentism. People don't change to agriculture and start building villages right away. In fact, initially agriculture is pretty ephemeral. It's used to offset bad years in which your gathering resources may not have come up. So you might plant some corn in a region you're planning to come back to, but you don't necessarily sit there and cultivate it. But it'll eventually lead to sedentism. So during the Archaic period, we have that kind of broad shift, but it's a very, 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 and I can't stress this enough, it's a very, very slow shift in the American Southwest. But both sedentism and agriculture have major impacts on human behaviors, in hunting behaviors. In the big three in New Mexico are corns, beans, and squash. Those were the big plants planted in New Mexico prior to the coming of the Spanish. You notice chili's not on there. Chili is something that comes in with the Spanish. Just to be absolutely clear, even though it existed in Mexico, it may have existed in small quantities in New Mexico, but people really didn't eat it until those Nahuatl-speaking natives from Mexico came up and brought with them chili. They sprinkled chili on everything, which is why we also get our name New Mexico. From the Archaic period, we shift into that sedentism period known as the Pueblo period. It once again, very, very regional. The example I use below for an example of how the Pueblo period is divided up is the Northern Rio Grande tradition, because people, I feel that probably most people associated with Mesa Prieta and Los Luceros are pretty familiar with this tradition. It usually goes early developmental, late developmental, coalition, and classic. And in a recent study, and I say recent, a recent study as in like, I want to say 5 years ago when I put this presentation together, we're looking at the bones of some of the C4, C3, anyway, the composition of carbon in people, Native Americans' bones. And it was really clear that maize represented a large portion of the diet for Pueblo peoples. About 80% of all calories taken in by Pueblo peoples in the Rio Grande was coming from corn. So really, people ate a lot of corn. And so while hunting existed, mostly they ate corn. Also, while they grew corns, beans, and squash, they mostly ate corn. But it's really broken up into 4 periods: early developmental, late developmental, coalition, classic. If you're wondering why they break the developmental period up into 2 time periods, if you'll notice that time period, it breaks at 900 in the Northern Rio Grande. Really what that means is people hanging out in the Northern Rio Grande prior to the existence of Chaco and after the existence of Chaco. And material culture changes as a result, primarily because even though Chaco may or may not have had some great houses built in the Rio Grande. I know there's some arguments for a great house or a great kiva at Pewaukee. Realistically, whether they existed in the area or not, trade and societal change came. People in the Rio Grande continued to live the way they had, but they couldn't ignore all the trade goods coming in from the West. Those later time periods are, we're going to talk about some more detail. But it's important to recognize that even as the sedentary way of life existed and we start the Pueblo period, many peoples continued to operate in hunter and gatherer communities. Hunter and gatherers still existed. In fact, these people are still living what in essence is an archaic lifestyle. But they're also developing new traits because they're trading and raiding with their neighbors. So they even though they may not practice agriculture themselves, they have access to agricultural products. And what you get is a kind of a symbiotic relationship between these agriculturalists, primarily centered later in time, obviously, centered around the Rio Grande. Before that, centered primarily at the Four Corners. These people working and trading with these nomadic groups and these nomadic ways of life. And I know, well, many people discuss, the Athabascan speaking people's Athabascan language. Some people argue that it doesn't come in right before European contact. I don't necessarily believe that, and I think there's been a lot of scholarship that's proved that Athabascans have been on the landscape much longer, Athabascan-speaking peoples, that is, or some nomadic groups. Certainly there were nomadic groups, whether they were Apache or not, living on the landscape throughout the entire Pueblo period. It's during this time that this late archaic, early developmental period, early on, we also see the transition from the Atlatl to the bow. The bow represents a much easier to use technology. The translation's pretty complete. Both amongst farmers and hunters and gatherers adopt the bow. It's ideal for, you're not, even hunters and gatherers are not taking huge amounts of large game in New Mexico. They're primarily focused on small animals. A bow and arrow is more ideal for those smaller game, but it's also an easier technology to learn. It's more mobile. It's a point and shoot technology. Now, diet breadth amongst Pueblo peoples, it certainly, you should see it get bigger over time. And I think I took this list from Pueblo del Encierro, but I may have even taken it from Ogopoge and Santa Fe. I don't remember which group. It doesn't matter. It gives you an idea as to the types of animals encountered. You'll notice there's a wide variety of animals listed there. You'll notice that there's a lot more birds listed in the group. There's a lot more small mammals listed in the group. And there's a lot of, at this point, what you're also seeing is a number of predators. So things such as bear and bobcat and badger. I actually saw a dead badger on the road to 550 going up to Jemez the other day. And I thought to myself, I was in the state truck, which I did not pull over, but I thought about pulling over and taking that badger. And then I thought to myself, I don't need to worry about it. I'm in the middle of, I'm between Santa Ana and Zia. Somebody will come up and pick this up. And sure enough, they did, like less than a half an hour later, well, an hour or two later when I came back through, or else I would have taken the badger. What you really get during this time period, and the reason why you see a lot more of these, and we'll talk more about these special animals in a minute, primarily what you see amongst these agriculturalists is garden hunting. And this is not the greatest image, but one of the few images I can use from Coronado Historic Site from the murals. And what you see here is a black-tailed jackrabbit who's been pierced by an arrow, likely representing garden hunting amongst the peoples at Quahua Pueblo down by Bernalillo. Garden hunting is really simple. So if you're going to raise crops in the field and whatnot, the real problem becomes if you don't manage the animal population, they destroy your crops. So you do these community-based rabbit hunts or rabbit drives, primarily where you get large numbers of the community together. They march out into the field, forming either a semicircle or circle or line. They draw the animals out in front of them, and then they take care of them with rabbit sticks or clubs. Usually thrown at the animals or just club the animals. Sometimes they use bows and arrows or even stones. Those are done primarily during the summer. They're done during the spring. They're done during the fall. And then winter is your time for big game hunting. We see this represented in Pueblo communities with traditional dances such as the deer dance. This fellow, I think, is supposed to represent a deer dancer at Pickeries. Could be wrong about exactly which Pueblo he's from, but during these times, as the fields lay fallow, the men are the people working the fields, primarily the men, are free to pursue large game, which include deer and buffalo, which can be pursued at farther distances. So these hunts are blessed with ritual dances, and so when you go out to the dances, say around King's Day or whatnot, you'll usually see the different tribes practicing some form of deer or buffalo dance. Traditionally, those dances were linked not with the celebration of new governors or with the new year or the Three Kings, as it were, but with these hunts that would take place during the winter months, primarily in December, January, and February. Throughout New Mexico. And in fact, Pueblo peoples probably moved very far afield during these times. We suspect, I think there's good evidence to suggest many Pueblo peoples are moving into Colorado. They're moving into Oklahoma and Texas onto the plains. They're moving not so much further west in our area because there are other peoples living out there, but the pursuit of large game is certainly driving Pueblo peoples pretty far afield. In many of these things, not just the deer dance, but many of these hunts have a spiritual component. In fact, many of the animals may not be taken for their caloric value at all, but to fulfill some sort of spiritual role. The birds were primarily taken in addition for food. They were taken primarily for their feathers, which could be used to perform curses or prayers. Turkeys were a special example. Turkeys were largely domesticated, but and managed to stay around Pueblo villages, but their feathers were often used in blankets. Predators' claws and teeth symbolize strength and protection. We see these things in regalia used by Native American peoples today. Consuming the animal could allow the hunter potentially to be imbued with the spirit of the creature. That seems maybe a little touchy-feely per se, but most Pueblo cultures or Native American cultures have some association with bringing the spirit of the animal into their bodies as part of the consumption. More of a connection to what you eat. In modern day, hunters look at this as having a connection with the animal you eat. So these traditions even exist amongst other groups as well. And really, when we want to explain how things are going good or how things are going bad for Pueblo peoples, usually what archaeologists use is something known as the Artiodactyl Index. So your artiodactyls are your hoofed animals, your deer, and your pronghorn, and your elk. Lagomorphs are your hares and your rabbits, and you can see here they're hunting what looks like, they almost look like blacktails, but they're small, so maybe they're desert cottontails. You see these guys hunting with a stick. Pretty much what the idea is, you take however many artiodactyls you have and you divide them by the number of lagomorphs and artiodactyls you have. So you take the number of big animals you have divided by the number of big and small animals you have, for lack of a better word. And the lower the percentage, the greater the focus on garden hunting and the potential for population or environmental stress. In fact, east of Santa Fe at Arroyo Hondo, they can paint using Artiodactyl Index, they can paint a very catastrophic view of what's happening at Arroyo Hondo during its last couple of years as the population, both the skeletal remains of the population shows, but certainly the diet of the people show that they're at this point pretty much starving on the landscape. It's very hard for them to go out there. They're eating a lot of small game. They don't have access to those higher valued resources of the landscape. So the Pueblo period goes on, and we're into European contact. It begins in 1539 with the Niza expedition, and is quickly followed by the Coronado expedition. We've got a great picture by Frederick Remington there of Coronado going through the desert. Is that what it looked like? Probably not, but it's a romanticized view of the Spanish conquistadors, and of course the impact of European contact is felt amongst Native Americans in a lot of different ways. But the biggest for us, as far as hunting goes, is they bring in, not only do they fight amongst the Pueblo peoples, you have amongst Coronado, you have obviously the Tiwish War in the Albuquerque area, but they bring in a lot of infectious diseases. And unfortunately, and this happens throughout the Americas, the Europeans bring not only warfare, but they primarily bring their diseases with them. And the Native American population really declines as a result of this. So the human population in New Mexico at the time of contact, 100 years later, is nowhere near, it's less than 25%. So the amount of people living in New Mexico in 1540 was substantially higher than the amount of people living in New Mexico in 1640. And the number of people living in 1640 was higher than the amount of people living in 1740. Population's going way down. And as this happens, as Native American populations die, animals on the landscape, the environment actually rebounds. And in fact, a lot's been made of this, and a lot of discussions. One of the things you often see in these early colonial discussions, especially along the eastern seaboard in the Americas, is these areas that are untouched by humans, or areas that the Native Americans must not know how to properly use these lands, because there's so much land that could be under cultivation. It could be done this. It could have this. It could be exploited in this way. When 90 to 95% of your population has passed away through disease and warfare, you don't have the amount of people to bring that stuff under cultivation. And so there's large areas of the New World which are largely abandoned when Europeans show up. And even in those places where Native American peoples are still living, their populations are so reduced that the animal population has really rebounded. And you get this kind of second golden age of hunting. Now, if we talk about the historic period in New Mexico, we have several subdivisions we can talk about. We have the Spanish colonial period, the Mexican period, the American territorial period, and the Mexican statehood. It's change not only brought about by, I see I have Onyante's statue on there. That's not there anymore, I don't think. It's good to know. I did not plan that image in this. I mean, I did, but years ago. These new groups that come in, obviously there's new cultural groups, but there's also new technologies brought in. We see, so there are military changes, agricultural changes, religious changes. That's the church in San Isidro, right there, the Catholic Church in San Isidro. They also bring in domesticated animals. And some of these are, the domesticated animals, we could say, cow, pig, goat, sheep, and chicken. I would hope most people familiar with Los Luceros know what these animals are. Probably have a deep rooted understanding of these animals. Many Native American communities quickly adopted these animals. In fact, in Jemez, we see the sheep and goat become popular in Jemez the second the priests show up with them. These represent readily available protein sources that reduce the reliance on hunting wild game. Really beneficial to all peoples. But probably the most impactful was, of course, the horse. It transformed both sedentary farmers and mobile hunter and gatherers. What we see here is, I believe, a Comanche man taking a bison. The horse was a food source for many Native American peoples. They ate the horse. They also used it to acquire other sources of protein. So it's also and it allows Native Americans to move around the landscape at much faster rates. So it really is a means of transportation. And the horse, slightly outside of our area of study, really transforms the Great Plains into these large, mobile, I don't even know if we call them hunters and gatherers. Probably they're better associated with nomadic pastoralists at this point, even though they hunt bison. The horse herds become very, very important. In fact, when the U.S. Army wants to destroy the Comanche, they just kill their horses. That's the way to end the problem. Unfortunately, the solution is dark, but it occurs in Paladuro Canyon, which is east of New Mexico, but not that far east. The horse also allows raiding to continue in a much wider spread. Raiding had always occurred, but it really it becomes associated with grain procurement and prestige items. You always had this going on, but domesticated animals, a goat or a sheep that's used to humans, that's grazing in a field, doesn't necessarily run away when an Apache person walks up to it with a bow, and that can be a problem. If the animal doesn't flee or doesn't show any signs of fear of humans, it can be taken quite easily as a food source by a raider. In raiding and hunting, even though they're different activities, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Some people would classify raiding as more of a warfare-related task, but I would argue that raiding is actually typically, especially amongst indigenous peoples, a subsistence strategy oftentimes. And certainly this is true amongst nomadic peoples in New Mexico. We also see the introduction of firearms. It's interesting, though, the introduction of firearms into Mexico, well, obviously it happened in 1540. New Mexico was in a terrible position to get gunpowder and materials from the Spanish and from Spanish settlements further south. And so you really don't see, interestingly enough, when Anglo explorers, so people from the east come, on the Santa Fe Trail and stuff like that, primarily the New Mexico residents, whether they be Hispanic or Native American, largely were using projectile point technology, so bows and arrows, things of that nature. Prehistoric weapons, such as bows and rabbit sticks, were still utilized in large numbers. Some of the wealthier Spanish had firearms, but it's interesting to note that even when we're talking about the Pueblo Revolt in 1680, because many of the Spanish living in the villa were so gentrified, they weren't used to acquiring their own food or even fighting. That when Ocherman needed to defend the villa from the incoming attacks from Pueblo peoples, he had to actually distribute weapons to the Spanish colonists, because at this point the Spanish primarily used indigenous labor, Native American peoples, to acquire these game animals and to conduct their wars for them. The transition of firearms become the predominant method of taking wild game really didn't occur till the mid to late 19th century, after the coming of the Santa Fe Trail, and especially after the import of cartridge munitions. So 1860s, 1870s, firearms become more and more important. And it's during this time period we really see an increase in commercial hunting in the 19th century. This starts obviously with mountain men and Native Americans and kind of the fur trade. It's important to note that Taos in particular, as far as New Mexico towns and cities, was really a hub for this kind of trade in the 19th century. It was a very important location for people selling and trading furs. These animals were obviously taken not so much for their meat, but for their commercial value further east, and for markets even as far afield as Europe. We have a fur trader right there, that picture. And eventually this becomes widespread. So as soon as you get these cartridge munitions, you're able to hunt animals in larger and larger numbers. And really in the 1800s, we see a decrease on all wild animals across the state or future state, the territory at this point. Elk and bison in particular, if they don't become endangered, they become extinct. So there's a debate whether there was still elk and bison in New Mexico by 1900. If they existed, they didn't exist for. There was only a handful of them. Other animals such as pronghorn, your American antelope, and beaver saw a major reduction in their native range. These animals were pretty much on the path to extinction as well. And at this point, by 1900, hunting is no longer a viable subsistence activity. You can't feed your people, your tribe, off hunting anymore. Hunting is you can't. You have to rely on domesticated animals in agriculture. It's just not possible. And of course, the 20th century response to this was, of course, the conservation movement. It begins really with Teddy Roosevelt. He was actually thinking, if we look at Teddy Roosevelt as a figure, he was actually thinking about these notions actually earlier, before he was president. In fact, he wrote a lovely book, which will be my only second recommendation for books, called The Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail by Theodore Roosevelt, with illustrations by Frederick Remington. It's a wonderful book. And it was written in the late 19th century about his experiences out west. Not only did he create conservation movement, he really created for many people back east, and for even people in the American Southwest, including indigenous peoples, the idea of hunting as a recreational sport. The idea that large game animals represented trophies. In fact, in his book, The Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail, he actually points out what some of those animals are, what some of those noble animals are to hunt. They include the mountain goat, the bighorn sheep, the elk. These are your kind of your quintessential Western large game species. And so as we moved into the 20th century, there was really an effort to bring some of these animals back into New Mexico. Elk and bison were reintroduced. The elk were actually, in fact, all the elk you see in the Valles Caldera today, which you can see some standing down there in the field below you, were brought in. These are guys from Colorado and Montana and from higher up in the Rocky Mountains. All the elk in the Jemez Mountains are not elk that existed there prehistorically. Their ancestors did not walk the mountains of the Jemez for generations. No, they really were brought in and intentionally planted there. Same thing with bison. Bison's being reintroduced primarily by farmers, but and by indigenous tribes. Other animals such as pronghorn were redistributed throughout the state so they could kind of proliferate. And then they also brought in some true antelope. So they brought in some other hunting species that they thought would be attractive. So that animal that you see below in the kind of the southwest corner of the slide, Namibian oryx, those are those are large African antelope that were brought in onto white sands to bulk up hunting opportunities. We also have Persian ibex, which is a form of goat that was gifted to New Mexico and brought into the Florida mountains by the Shah of Iran. These animals are open to hunting opportunities today. And then we also have other animals that are just moving further north as time goes on. So prehistorically, there was really no, I mean, so if you went back to like Mimbres times in southwestern New Mexico, you wouldn't find mention really of the peccary, the colored peccary, or what we would call today in New Mexico the javelina, which you can see here. But these guys are moving further and further north every year. In fact, if they're not in Albuquerque, they'll be in Albuquerque soon. They're really a great adapter, and as climate change continues to dry out our world, these guys are moving in. Really fun animal to hunt too. Really fun because the way they run, they look so adorable. Okay, so hunting today. There's a wide array of practices done today. These include traditional practices such as killing for religious purposes, as well as modern sporting practices. Commercial hunting continues, albeit in a very highly controlled system, which no longer has a wide market. So if you're really interested in trapping in New Mexico, you can. However, you will never make any money. You might be able to make a little money, but you're never going to be able to make profits. And if your life is to be a trapper, you're going to live a life of poverty in New Mexico. But all three systems continue, with the exception of subsistence hunting. It's not realistic to think that you can hunt and survive on hunting for all your hunting and gathering for all your calories in New Mexico, based upon the system we have today. And with that. So conclusions. I got some conclusions. We've got some conclusions before we answer some questions. So what are my conclusions? Well, what points do I want you to get from all this? First of all, hunting is a cultural expression which extends throughout the entirety of human occupation in New Mexico. It's not just something you do. It's a part of who you are. It's a part of who Native American or indigenous peoples are. And the archaeological evidence of the hunting is very varied. It includes not only projectile points, but animal bones and landscape features. And we talked about some of those things and how they inform us on how hunting existed during different times in New Mexico's past. It's also important to note, and they're doing digital hunter safety today. My twins are. They've been doing it all week. They talked about primitive hunting strategies, and they talked about the muzzle loader in bow and arrow. It's interesting to note that based upon archaeological evidence, it's the Atlatl, not the bow, not the gun, that was the hunter's primary tool throughout most of New Mexico's history. So if you really want to go to a primitive hunting method, you really should be using an Atlatl. Not that many hunters would go for that, but that realistically is the primitive or early hunting strategy. Secondly, from these things, we can infer population growth and environmental degradation through the examining of hunting strategies. What people are eating, what people are hunting really talks not so much about necessarily their choices, but what's available on the landscape, how many people, and how the environment's doing as a whole. And hunting is simply not a subsistence practice, but a spiritual, commercial, or even recreational activity. And that hunting continues to this day. With that, I'm going to put up, you see me with some black-tailed jackrabbits. I specifically chose those because of the mural at Coronado shows black-tailed jackrabbit hunting. They're gigantic. These are out by Deming. I am an avid hunter myself, so it's not just something I preach about. But I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to be able to. Ethan's going to work with me to find out what questions you guys might have about hunting in New Mexico from an archaeological perspective. Though I will try to do your best to answer any questions you have on modern day hunting. The only thing I would ask is that anything I say about modern day hunting, especially if I'm talking about legal laws, please check with Game and Fish before you do anything. On that note, hopefully everyone here who's interested in hunting was successful in their draws. But right now, Game and Fish is still opened up for sandhill crane hunting and for some youth pheasant hunts throughout New Mexico. If those are opportunities that appeal to you. All right. And you can email me later on if you decide you don't want to answer questions now. But with that, I will find out what Ethan has as far as questions coming in from
All right. So Ethan Ortega here from Los Luceros. I'll be the ghost voice off the screen asking Matt some questions. Matt, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to present to us here tonight. That was very interesting.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. It's very nice to be able to combine my two loves into one lecture.
Great. So just to kick off the questions, I have a question for you. So I understand your son is named Clovis. Did you name him after the archaeological period?
Both. I actually I spent a lot of my time working on early medieval Europe, and so Clovis is the first Christian king of France. But I also have an absolute love for hunting, and there was no greater hunter on the New Mexico landscape than the Clovis people, which are actually named after the French king. So they're named after the town in eastern New Mexico, which is named after the French king, and so on. In fact, Clovis is a Germanic word. And I named my other children Alaric and Matilda, which are both strong Germanic historical names. So I didn't name my second son Folsom, though I did have that discussion with my wife before he was born. And in fact, we joked that I joked at the time that Cody Complex is another famous archaeological projectile point tradition with a large hunting tradition, and they almost became Folsom and Cody instead of Alaric and Matilda. But instead, we went with the Germanic names as opposed to the hunting names per se. And Clovis, for his part, he has hunted with me several times. He is a brave hunter in his own right, and I have hopes for that the rest of my kids will continue the tradition.
Awesome. Well, thanks for answering that. And now to the real question. So these questions have been submitted by people that are viewing your live stream. And so the first question we have is from Albert, and he says, regarding paleo diet, does coastal route migration imply a range of ocean food sources as well as land foods?
Mostly maritime sources. So interestingly, they don't have a lot of land terrestrial sources. In fact, only one of the places, the only other place where it looks like people are going inland. You got to remember, Clovis people actually spread across the Americas, or at least across North America. The early guys along the coast, and they have gone inland a little bit in California, and they base that they may have gone inland in California. If you look at the amount, the diversity of indigenous languages in California, it's amazing. There's a lot of different languages, a lot of variability spoken. Those languages all had to fragment off from something really early on, but they don't go very far inland. In fact, when we look at human populations along the coast during this Paleoindian time, we're primarily talking about peoples that are focused on maritime resources. However, there's a problem with all of those studies, which is the fact that the sea level's actually risen. So while most of these maritime peoples live right on the coast, many of their archaeological sites are now underwater. And so it's taking underwater maritime archaeologists to kind of find those early patterns of pre-Clovis peoples, as it were. And it probably should be noted that while unfortunately there is if you look back at some of the earlier textbooks on New Mexico history, you'll hear something called Sandia culture as a pre-Clovis culture that originated probably in the Albuquerque area. Unfortunately, that culture appears to be it's fake. It's fake, and it's been documented. The places where it's been documented, it's very clear that a specific archaeologist probably faked his results. So those are not real. Unfortunately, the evidence that Sandia is an earlier culture than Clovis is probably not correct.
Great. Thanks for that answer. So the next question we have is from Patricia. She says, did stampede kill result in abandoned carcasses? Did they not preserve the excess in somehow?
So we don't think they could preserve all of it. They certainly, that's a broad statement. So I would hope that many groups did preserve as many of them as they could. But what you get with these stampede kills is these large bone beds, sometimes which show multiple incidents where the same ledge or arroyo was used multiple times by indigenous groups to kill large numbers of animals. There could be hundreds of animals in these bone beds where they drove them right off a cliff or drove them into these killing fields. Yeah, ideally they would have used every part. Unfortunately, there is a limit to what you can keep and carry. And also to remember these Paleo-Indian hunters, maybe later hunters, so other indigenous peoples later in time to use this similar strategy. But these early mobile hunters and gatherers, they have to carry with them on the landscape everything they need to survive, right? They might do a couple caches out on the landscape, but really they got to carry most of their stuff. They're definitely killing more animals and more meat than they can carry around on the landscape. And they need to move from place to place. So it might have been, these practices might have been associated with feasting. They may have been associated with larger groups coming together. But yes, there was probably some waste. In fact, these wastes probably contributed to the decline of some of our extinct mammals in North America.
Yeah, I seem to remember an instance that occurred at Blackwater Draw where it seems like there was even selective butchering going on in a mass kill incident where they were actually focusing on the tongues of the bison, and that was pretty much the only thing.
Yeah, and certainly it should be noted that indigenous peoples were not the only peoples that practiced this overkill. In fact, it was primarily European and Anglo peoples in the 19th century that led to the mass extinction of modern day bison in the American Southwest. And it should be noted that even up into colonial times, there's mentions of bison as close as the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado. So these animals weren't very far away in the landscape until the next extinction event, which was with Europeans. But it's hard sometimes to reconcile the fact that human beings, this goes for all human beings, can be pretty hard on the environment. And the modern conservation movement has tried to limit some of that impact on the environment. But every year there are hundreds, if not thousands, of hunters in the United States that do not follow state and federal regulations in regards to taking game. And this leads to some of our problems, both in New Mexico and elsewhere.
Great. So we have some really interesting questions stacking up. The next question is from Marilyn, and she asks, wouldn't horticulture be a more appropriate term in the Archaic? Agriculture includes plants and animal husbandry, no?
So it depends. So yes, you can use the word horticulture in the Archaic. I don't even know if you want to use any of those words for what's going on throughout most of the Archaic. These plants that are being, it might be as limited. So when I was working down by Deming, we were looking at agriculture actually very early in southwestern New Mexico. Lots of evidence of early agriculture in southwestern New Mexico. The site I was working on really didn't have it had the earliest, supposedly the earliest date for cotton production in the American Southwest, but really not the earliest corn. But it was obvious there that their primary focus at being at that site in working plant resources, they were interested in mesquite. The corn that they perhaps just threw on the Mimbres floodplain, as it were, because at that point the Mimbres River really doesn't exist. It's just, if it rains real hard, water will come down the ephemeral stream. The corn was at best secondary, if not tertiary, to what they were doing. They probably were more interested in killing turtles than they were in growing corn. Really, what it might have resulted in is just throwing a couple seeds on the ground, and if it grew up the next year, it been great. If it didn't, it didn't. So yeah, sort of horticulture, but perhaps even more ephemeral than that. So you're looking at, rather than defined terms, I would suggest you're looking at some sort of gray continuity that goes through the period, with a greater and greater intensification for agriculture as it goes. Also, it's important to note that amongst all the different groups in New Mexico, we're talking about a wide range of indigenous populations with their own distinct cultures. The focus on agriculture, the amount of time they spent on agriculture versus the amount of time they spent on gathering versus hunting, depended upon which group you're looking at. Some groups were really focused on agriculture. Other groups, even though they consist of the Pueblo name, later on they seem to be more associated with hunting and gathering, and could almost be better argued to be hunters and gatherers that farm, as opposed to agriculturalists themselves.
Awesome. So Marilyn also asks, did these hunter-gatherers at the same time as Pueblo have a specific area of the landscape they used, rather than moving around without any recognition of boundaries or other hunter-gatherers and settled peoples?
Okay, so, and I probably should have mentioned this time. So even Pueblo peoples, first of all, and this is a completely different talk, and I primarily use it as Jemez as an example. Pueblo peoples were amazing farmers, amazing farmers. So I just want to get that out of the way. Now I want to say what I'm going to say. The American Southwest is a terrible place for agriculture. So while Pueblo peoples were really good at agriculture and they were able to farm in places we wouldn't think of farming today, most of the New Mexico landscape is not adequate for farming. All of those areas were exploited both by agriculturalists doing hunter and gather activities and hunter and gatherers doing those activities as well. It also should be noted that those same nomadic peoples, remember, they're trading with these agriculturalists. They are infringing upon their land. And sometimes we get into a habit of drawing cultural maps in New Mexico. And what they do is we'll make these nice boundaries. This boundary will be where the Jemez are. This boundary will be where the Caras are. This boundary will be where the Dene are, the Navajo, and so on and so forth. We usually draw these boundaries with a line between them. The reality is obviously much more complex. People were moving around the landscape and sharing a lot of the same land. So, for example, if we were to look at indigenous land use in the Valles Caldera, certainly the Jemez were probably top dogs at using the caldera during prehistoric times. But also Tewa-speaking peoples from the Pajarito Plateau and from the Rio Chama were certainly using the Valles Caldera. Nomadic groups such as the Athabascan peoples, the Proto-Dene or Tine, the Apache peoples, were also using that landscape. And we can see these peoples and their various cultures manifested on that landscape in different ways. So it's not necessarily set boundaries. Everybody was using all the land. However, most of the land in New Mexico is only useful as hunting and gathering lands. Most of it cannot be brought under agriculture, even under the skill of these indigenous Pueblo or village peoples.
Thank you for that. All right, so the next question comes from Nick. And Nick says, my understanding is that a primary purpose of a projectile point is piercing the animal's hide, and most damage is done by the shaft or foreshaft rattling around in the engine room. Are you suggesting that shrinking point sizes during the Archaic imply shrinking animal size?
There is a correlation. So no, I don't think they're necessarily the same, but it does more than just pierce the hide. It also provides weight. So for example, think of yourself as the modern day hunter, okay? Let's ignore what we're thinking of with arrows. If you fire a 22, it's not just 22 is a very, very small bullet. You fire a very, very small bullet. It's not just the piercing of that kills the animal, but a lot of times the weight of that projectile not only suggests not only how deep the penetration goes. So the heavier, larger projectile point, not only is it potentially making a bigger hole, because remember, it's tied, it is correlated with shaft, but the shaft that you're using on a Clovis projectile point is much larger than the thin reed you're using on a Pueblo projectile point. And the weight of that projectile point, the weight of that bullet, or in this case, the weight of that projectile point, you use larger weights on larger game. For example, you use a heavier grain bullet on an elk than you do on a cottontail. You don't need a heavy grain bullet on a cottontail. The same thing goes through for projectile points. It's easier to kill an elk shooting an Atlatl armed with a Clovis point and a Clovis dart, which is a large piece of wood, than it is with a small bow and arrow often made with a reed with a very small obsidian projectile point attached to it. So yes, can you kill the animal? You can kill an animal with a 22 today. But you usually recommend a higher caliber, a bigger caliber for a larger game. The same goes through for prehistoric projectile points.
So just a few more questions here, Matt. Lexi asks, can you talk a bit about coyote hunting in the past and present?
So, okay. So prehistoric, it certainly did exist. We find coyote bones in almost every assemblage. The modern predator hunting of coyotes, which has really gained traction in the last 20 years, I would argue that really is something that doesn't exist until the emphasis on predator hunting that we see today is primarily a focus on Anglo hunting methods. And it really comes out of that tradition, unfortunately, not so much an indigenous tradition, but a ranching tradition. The idea that these animals can kill your livestock. And certainly that European tradition of killing these predators because they pose threats to your herd is certainly not new. Native American peoples probably killed predators for many of the same reasons. There appear to be spiritual reasons why some predators were taken, especially if you're going to shoot a mountain lion with a bow. First of all, I can tell you right now, there are very few modern hunters that would shoot a mountain lion with a piece of reed and a small little fragment of obsidian attached to it, because that probably puts you in more danger than the mountain lion does, because the mountain lion's going to get upset. Same thing goes with a bear. These are very dangerous animals to take with Stone Age technology. So these predator hunting strategies probably come about, are become more focused once you get cartridge munitions. I don't know of any specific studies on it, but predator hunting, even in my lifetime, was kind of a fringe element that cowboys did on the ranch to kind of its own hunting phenomenon. And I would argue even maybe perhaps, and this would be a question for Game and Fish, if the uptake isn't the increase in laws. So for example, if I want to go out and hunt a deer, I've got to get drawn for a deer. There's huge restrictions on where I can hunt the deer, when I can hunt the deer, what I can use to hunt the deer, all based on my license. In New Mexico, there are absolutely no restrictions on killing coyotes. So for a lot of the weekend, and I don't mean to bash it, but a lot of the hunters that perhaps don't have the patience to try for game tags or something like that, perhaps even our own laws have pushed people towards the hunting of coyotes more for sport, primarily because it represents one of the few animals you can take. And considering the focus is now not on subsistence, but on trophies, you don't have that thing, well, I don't want to eat a dog. Most people aren't going to eat a dog anyways. So you get that whole loss. I can't really explain it. I'm not a coyote hunter by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't think indigenous societies focus very much on killing the coyote. In fact, it would not surprise me, even though we find them in the archaeological record, if there weren't cultural taboos against killing some coyotes in some cultures. But I can't speak to that myself.
Yeah, it's very, unless you have skull fragments, it can be very hard to distinguish a domestic dog from a coyote in an archaeological site. Okay, yeah. So our next question is from Sharon. She said, I didn't see snake on your list. Is there evidence that they were used?
Yeah, they were eaten. I think it was just whichever sites I pulled the examples from. There's plenty of examples of snakes in the archaeological record being eaten by indigenous peoples. It's very common. Frogs are another one, though. I've actually been on a kick recently. I've been learning all about frog gigging, specifically with how to catch frogs using a fishing line, because frogs are strange and they'll bite at anything. And I've been learning these new strategies. The problem is, and nowadays we have talked about interesting animals that have taken a ride. We have lots of invasive frog species like bullfrog in the Bosque del Apache. And actually, you're in the middle of hunting season right now. If you want to go down to the Bosque del Apache and hunt bullfrogs, just don't do it with artificial light, because that's illegal in New Mexico, which is usually how my redneck brethren in other states, and I will include myself as a redneck, most of it's done with the hunting of artificial light. But that being said, spadefoot toads, I'm not sure you can eat them or not. I said most animals are not poisonous. You could just eat the meat. Spadefoot toads actually secrete a kind of like soapy substance on their back. And I've seen my dog take one and put it in its mouth, and it got all funny for a while. So I don't know if you as a human being would want to eat a spadefoot toad. We do find them in the archaeological record. They could also be just burying themselves in the dirt and dying down there. But amphibians, probably at least some, definitely snakes. And lizards too. We should just go on that. Lizards too. They eat lizards.
All right, so the next question is from David, and he said, I didn't know that Atlatl was a Paleolithic technology. Is that a well-accepted position?
Absolutely. Yeah, Atlatls existed. In fact, they were probably brought over by the hunters and gatherers from Asia. Atlatl technology existed throughout human history in the New World.
David also asks, what is the date for early cotton in New Mexico? In southern Arizona, it's like 500 to 600 Common Era.
Yeah, they actually have it, I think, earlier in Arizona, in some parts of Arizona. We had it late Archaic. I think we had about 0 AD. I'd have to go back and look at it. I'm not convinced it's the earliest cotton date. Unfortunately, down there nowadays, it was first of all, it was one seed that was found, and it was burned. It was found under matate in good context, but the seed couldn't be dated itself. We actually had to date it based upon the context in which it was found, and rodents could have brought it down there. There's a lot of cotton production in southwestern New Mexico today, so I'm not saying it's wrong. What I'm saying is I'm a little cautious. I'd like to see more dates, earlier dates. You don't ever want to be the first, at least as far as I'm concerned, you don't ever want to be the first at something in archaeology, because chances are you're wrong or you're misinterpreting something. It's in archaeology, it's data, repeatable data over and over again that proves something's real and that something's true. It's not just finding it one time. Even though the context looks great, it doesn't mean it is. Also, people really focus. I had talks where I did one on the Archaic in southwestern New Mexico. I gave a whole talk, and I swear everybody afterwards just asked me about that one piece of cotton. And I was like, you just missed you see the one tree in the forest that I just tried to show you in the talk. People go crazy. I've had people tell me, well, they probably weren't using it for clothes. They were eating the seeds. And I was thinking to myself, man, that's really, yeah, you can get some caloric intake from the seeds, but it's hard to imagine you process cotton just to eat the little seeds. I'm by no means a cotton expert in the American Southwest. So let me make that clear now. But I think it was, and you can look it up. It was a DOT report, or you can email me after this talk, and I can look up the actual date for it. Just remember, the date is actually based upon a C14 date in close proximity. It's not based upon dating the cotton piece itself.
Awesome. So I'll go ahead and send a private message over to David with your email address.
Yeah, I'll answer tomorrow.
Two more questions. One from Van. Is there any evidence that sandhill cranes were taken by garden hunting?
Oh, God, yes. Yes, without a shadow of a doubt. In fact, I joked with Ethan before we had this talk. I said I probably should go back and create a field and stream edition of this talk, because I blow off some really important concepts that I just don't get to. And I try to time all my talks at about an hour. And so we were right at an hour when we ended. So sandhill cranes are an interesting beast. Waterfowl in general in New Mexico were not that common during the Archaic period. But as people continued to farm, and most of this evidence comes from the Rio Grande, so bear with me here. I'm going to talk primarily about the Rio Grande. So I'm going to ignore most of the rest of New Mexico for a few minutes and just talk about the Rio Grande. During the developmental period, as people kind of moved into these sedentary villages, they brought huge tracts of the Rio Grande floodplain under major cultivation. And they planted these corns, beans, and squash. They created huge fields of it. And by doing so, they altered the environment which surrounded them and made it ideal for waterfowl, specifically for sandhill cranes. And so these animals migrated into New Mexico in greater and greater numbers. In fact, a coalition period, developmental and coalition period site just to the south of Coronado Historic Site. It's actually the campground today. The most common fauna collected from that site. So when you look at all the animal bones, what were they primarily eating as they grew corn, beans, and squash along the Rio Grande and Bernalillo? And it was primarily geese. So sandhill cranes, geese, primarily probably Canadian geese or Canada geese, but also probably snow geese, and a variety of ducks and other waterfowl really came in large numbers and became a very big portion of the diet for many peoples along the Rio Grande and along some of our other major rivers. I have not looked into the Pecos directly, but my guess is the Pecos River in the areas where Pueblo peoples were colonizing probably had fairly large consumption of waterfowl as well. We might also see that along the San Juan River to some extent, but I don't know about the data in that area. So I'm using the Rio Grande as an example. And that came out from an article by the Office of Contract Archaeology several years ago. They were talking specifically the fact that you can actually track as more land goes under agriculture. The population grows and they start bringing more and more of the Rio Grande under agriculture. The waterfowl numbers actually increase as they're spreading throughout the area, and that becomes a primary dietary resource for them. That's a good question, though. This is something I should talk about in the talk, but I don't.
Thanks, Matt. And that's a conversation that we've been having with the Audubon Society. And the publication from the Office of Contract Archaeology is by Robin Cordero, and it's called Pueblo and Agriculture and its Impact on the Migratory Behavior of Birds. And that was published in Kiva in 2018. So it's pretty recent.
See, and I remembered all that off the top of my head. And I assume Ethan has it in front of him, because if you remember all that off the top of your head, man, damn, you're good. You got it in front of you. I see you not.
I have it right in front of me.
No, it's a good article. It's an absolutely good article, and it really focuses. It really does show that, without a shadow of a doubt, those animals became real big-time protein sources for Pueblo peoples, and we see it at a lot of archaeological sites in at least the Rio Grande area. And my guess is, as you see greater, more recent studies, you're going to see that spread to other parts of New Mexico. Water is, and this is a big part of our interpretation in New Mexico historic sites. Water use and development along water, whether it be the Rio Grande, the Pecos, all of our sites have water near them. Water is the lifeblood of the American Southwest, and perhaps no river symbolizes that more than the Rio Grande. So I'm sure people along Pecos would argue with that, but that's all right.
All right, and so the final question we have today, which is from Marilyn of the Friends of El Paso Museum of Archaeology. She is basically summarizing this. She's just curious about why you didn't mention pre-Clovis culture and their hunting methods.
So, because there's no evidence of, I'm going to be very clear about this, because I know that you can read about it and you'll see pictures that say Sandia culture. There is no I want to make this clear right now, other than for the acts of a archaeologist that we'll just call Fib and Hibben. There is no evidence, absolutely no evidence of pre-Clovis peoples in New Mexico. There is evidence along the West Coast with things, and it's not my expertise. I'm not an archaeologist, primarily in Canada, with I believe it's called the Denali tradition, and some of the traditions out there on the West Coast. Those are definitely pre-Clovis, but I want to make it clear that the best evidence we have right now comes out of a dissertation and book in 2016 known as Primeros Mexicanos. It's a look at Clovis hunters and gatherers in the Sonoran region, as well as Clovis period in Paleoindian archaeology in Mexico as a whole. It gives a great idea. While it only hints at the notion that these people came up from Sonora, it's a much better argument than the idea that there's some sort of in situ Sandia culture that comes through New Mexico. Sandia culture, as I said, has only been found at a few sites. Those sites appear to have been salted by an archaeologist. who's no longer with us, and people are now more open to speak out. In fact, in the book I published this year, there was an article about that same archaeologist faking murals creating his own fake murals and ideas at Pottery Mound down south of Albuquerque. It appears that almost many of his more interesting achievements were fakes, and that's not. It is a dig at him. It's not a dig at the archaeological community, and that's where I go back to that whole argument on cotton. You don't want to be the first to discover something, because unless lots of other people are finding the same date you are, the same thing you are, chances are you misinterpreted it or something got astray, because that's not how archaeology works. But I just want to be clear, pre-Clovis in New Mexico, I don't like it. Somebody might, there are archaeologists who will swear that Clovis people are not indigenous peoples. They are European colonists that came in and rode across the Atlantic, and there's lots of theories out there. But I want to be clear, my own particular perspective is that Clovis culture is something that the human beings migrate in around 10,000 BC. They're coming in from northern Mexico, probably from the swamps of Sonora. The Clovis culture is really focused along these marshlands, which makes perfect sense if that's what they're doing along the coast in this specific area. The culture probably is already formulated, so these pre-Clovis peoples have already identified what the projectile point's going to look like, what the toolkit's going to look like. It's all fully fleshed out so that when it shows up in New Mexico, and it shows up at sites in eastern New Mexico and in central New Mexico, the culture is already fully elaborated. It's fully thought out. It's going to spread throughout North America and go everywhere, and it's going to hunt these animals. And it makes sense if they're marshland hunters. I mean, even though we have limited evidence, it even makes sense if you think about it. We find lots and lots of Clovis projectile points in the eastern United States, primarily the southeastern United States. We find them in plowed fields, but all those lands during the Pleistocene would have been marshy as you can be. They're the perfect areas for these Clovis peoples to hunt in. Absolutely. You don't need to have a pre-Clovis culture in New Mexico. And any idea that Sandia culture is problematic, the idea that these are European hunters and gatherers that somehow are replaced by later Native American peoples is ridiculous. It's insulting to the indigenous communities that exist around us today. There's a lot of great archaeology in New Mexico, and certainly there are opinions other than those that I've expressed to you tonight. I would certainly, if you don't like the opinion I have or the information I've expressed, which I'm happy to point you towards the data on, I'm sure you can find archaeologists that would give you a different opinion. So I think the Sandy thing, hopefully people that's died. All right.
Okay, well, it's interesting that Frank Gibbons' name came up because isn't he also involved with the import of exotic game species in the 20th century into New Mexico?
He was a diehard hunter, and in fact, if it looks strange to you, he's a hunter and archaeologist. That's so unique. No, it's really not. You go out there at the Valles Caldera to hunt in the wintertime, and it's a who's who of archaeologists in New Mexico. So go out and ask your fellow archaeologists, and you'll probably find some hunters in the group. So we tend to be drawn to hunting because it is considered almost and I use this term loosely, a primitive skill, as it were. But I tend to think of it this way. Most archaeologists love to be outside. They love to be on the landscape. We spend most of our day wandering around in the forest and the desert looking for archaeological sites and surveying. That's exactly what a hunter does, only instead of looking for archaeological sites, he's looking for the game on the landscape. In fact, I was out rabbit hunting with my son Saturday or Sunday. Anyway, it doesn't matter. One of the days this last weekend, I was out rabbit hunting with my son. Stumbled upon a pit house out in the area around La Jolla, just while I was out there rabbit hunting. So that there is very little distinction between the two. A lot of the things that hunters love to do, archaeologists also love to do.
All right. Well, that was our last question. And Matt, thank you so much on behalf of Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project and Los Luceros Historic Site. We were just thrilled to have you as a speaker, and you did an amazing job. Thank you.
That's good. My shout out to the El Paso Archaeological Society, since I think some of them are on as well. Have a nice night, guys.
Thank you, Matt.